Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People's Forum. Thank you so much for spending your precious Saturday with us. My name is Kate. I help support 1804 Books, the bookstore you passed on your way in. We're dedicated to sharing revolutionary theory and socialist literature to our community and organizers who are interested. We have a lot of programming actually this summer, so if you're here next Friday, we have a Swana Beats party. We also have open classes starting next week on slave rebellion in the Americas and art for organizing struggle. So if you're around, please sure to follow us on all of our social media and follow our email lists. Come by often. We also have a cafe, bookstore, all that stuff. So be sure to come through. I'm very excited to be hosting today's book talk on Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives. This book collects Donna's essays on how social protest is challenging our current system of state violence and mass incarceration, from the origins of the Black Panther Party to Clinton's war on drugs, to Ferguson to the movement for Black Lives today, exposing the devastating consequences of overlapping punishment campaigns against gangs, drugs, and crime on poor and working class populations of color. And so I'm very excited to introduce the author, Donna Murch, who is the Associate Professor of History at Rutgers and author of today's book. Her research specializations are historical studies of mass incarceration and war on drugs, Black power and civil rights, social movements, and post-war US cities. Donna is also the author of Living for the City from UNC Press, which won the Phyllis Wheatley Prize, and she has published articles in many journals, including the Journal of American History, Journal of Urban History, the Black Scholar, Souls, Perspectives, New Politics, and Jacobin. And she's currently working on her next project, Capitalism Plus Dope, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. Joining Donna today in conversation is Chenjerai Kumanyika, a researcher, journalist, and artist who works as an assistant professor in Rutgers University's Department of Journalism and Media Studies and NYU now. His research and teaching focus on the intersections of social justice and emerging media in the cultural and creative industries. He's written about these issues in journals such as Popular Music and Society, the Routledge Companion to Advertising and Promotional Culture and Technology, Pedagogy and Education. Currently, he's the co-executive producer and co-host of Gimlet Media, his new podcast on the Civil War, and he has been a contributor to Transom, NPR Code Switch, All Things Considered, and Visibilia, Vice, and he's a news analyst for Rising Up Radio. I would also be remiss to not let you know that today is Assata's birthday. I didn't plan this, but it was a very lucky surprise for all of us. So all the more reason that this is a really important day for us to be honoring her life and her struggle, and carrying her legacy forward in her work. So of course, I'll start us off with the famous quote from her. "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." And so I'll turn it over to you two. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me first of all start out by thanking the People's Forum, Kate, and everyone who put work in behind the scenes to make this stuff come together. You know, one of the things that I've learned, one of the most powerful revolutionary skills we can have is sometimes the more tedious and boring stuff of organizing, organizing people's travel and things like that. So I just want to honor and recognize and thank you for that work. I also want to give a shout out to those who might be watching remotely. We want you to feel included in the discussion, and I hope that you are able to participate. And finally, before we turn to this, I just want to say that it's really exciting, I think, for both of us, I hope, and for me to be here at the People's Forum. I was here before taking a workshop with David Harvey. My wife and I came, and it was really powerful. I was like, wow, this is going to be here at this particular place. And just to see how this organization has grown, all the powerful radical work is going on. I hope we continue to all come back and support it with all our resources and energy and time, because it's just really valuable and unique. And it's going to be needed capacity as we face what's coming. So Assata Taught Me. I'm here with my colleague and comrade and mentor, Donna Murch. And I just want to say, for most people, for folks who have not read this book yet, wow, this book is such a powerful and needed set of reflections for this time. I keep coming back to it. It's a book that I continue to read. And part of the reason why, I just want to say before I have Donna talk about what inspired her to write this book is, we see at this time a lot of mobilizations, We actually see a lot of videos and video accounts of our oppression. We see news coverage of things, for example, coming out of the Supreme Court and things of that nature. And I think that that's led to a sense that everything we need to understand about our movements is right in front of our eyes, right? It's right on the camera. We could just, maybe the political task is just to name what's on the camera. But in fact, the sort of architecture of the things that are behind all the forces that oppress us are not really only in front of the camera. And many times they require a historical analysis. And I think that this book does that so brilliantly. One other thing I want to say that I think is really important right now, and if we look at the strategy that has emerged from the right and even from sort of liberals and centrist Democrats, what we can see is the importance of strategy, of precise analysis that really lets us know what we're fighting against. In the wake of the George Floyd protests, one of the things that happened was you had all of these companies expressing solidarity, media, companies sort of using the George Floyd test to create new forms of representation. I mean, it could almost look at, like, if you look at the media landscape, it almost could look like we just won, right? We got a whole bunch of Black voices, and yet it seems that we're still up against something monstrous. And so Assata Taught Me, and the analysis in this book, I think is really necessary for us to actually understand the mechanisms of racial capitalism and things that we're facing, and the history and what we can take from history as we go forward. So, really important book. But let me just turn, Donna, welcome to the People's Forum. And I just wonder if you could talk about what inspired you to put together this collection of essays and why you called it Assata Taught Me.
Thank you so much, Chenjerai. I just want to thank Kate for her very generous introduction, and thank Chenjerai, of whom I'm a real fan. His podcasts are amazing, and he's done such important work in media, in representation, and as an organizer, and is so modest. He doesn't always talk about that. So I would also consider him a mentor of mine. This collection of essays, many of them were written between, I'd say, 2012 and 2016. And they were written with a real animating spirit of joy at watching the rise of what came to be known as the Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives. And my first book was about the Black Panther Party, and I'd spent a lot of time through oral histories and using traditional archives, using all different kinds of historical methodologies to reconstruct a history of the Black Panther Party. And so those same kinds of historians' approaches, using both archival and non-archival sources, really doing something almost like ethnography. My family is from St. Louis, even though I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. So immediately when Ferguson jumped off, I flew down and to be there and to observe and to talk to people in person. And so it was the real joy at seeing all the organizing going on. And I felt as if that period from 2012 to 2016 in many ways was a response to things that I had been studying and writing about for a long time, which is the importance of the Black liberation movement throughout American history, but my focus was always in the post-war period and the genesis of the Black Panther Party in Oakland. And in the period after that, the enormity of state repression, the ways in which the activists themselves were criminalized. We have a whole generation of activists that became political prisoners. This is one of the reasons that I think Assata Shakur is so loved and celebrated, is because she is indeed free and living in Cuba. So that's where many of the essays come from. Most of them are about the dynamics of incarceration and racial capitalism, but they end really with a story of mobilization in the movement for Black lives. I chose the title because I first saw this in protests. Assata Taught Me. I saw it on t-shirts. I later saw it on bumper stickers. You had the Assata's Daughters that were created in Chicago. And as a Panther historian who's almost a generation and a half older than many of the Black Lives Matter activists, I first encountered the Black Panther Party through Assata's autobiography when it was written and published from Cuba in 1987. So in the 80s, at the height of Ronald Reagan, this is the period of Iran-Contra, better understood as Contra cocaine, the escalation of a longstanding drug war, the anti-communist wars in Central America. The voice of Assata Shakur to me was an introduction to a form of Black radical politics that I didn't even know existed, coming from very conservative Catholic schools in Western Pennsylvania. So to see a younger generation have the same process of politicization and consciousness raising through reading Assata was just wonderful for me. And I was struck that it was a rank and file party member. The Black Panther Party was founded in New York, so the, Minister of Defense and the Central Committee, all of the leadership remained in Oakland, almost all men, with a few exceptions, Elaine Brown and Kathleen Cleaver on the Central Committee. But that for younger generation, they chose a New York Panther versus California. They chose a Black woman, most importantly, and that they chose someone who was a member of the faction, the Black Liberation Army. So in other words, it was a very different remix of Panther history. And so a lot of this book is an attempt to talk about the forces that they were mobilizing against, and then what the animating spirit of both the Black Panther Party and Assata Shakur, what that meant to subsequent generations.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that those themes, right, the ways that history, because even when at the emergence of Black Lives Matter, which we'll get to, there were some versions of them trying to talk about the powerful work that had been done in terms of gender, right, in terms of forging a sort of less patriarchal movement front. But there was sometimes a way to narrate that as though it was completely new. It had never been done before. There's no history informing it that we can learn from. And of course, that's not the case. And I think this book really illustrates why. So I want to talk about racial capitalism a little bit. For many years in both my practice as a scholar and an organizer, I've felt this tension between how people talk about race and class. Often folks are, some people insist, it's almost like people are trying to figure out what's the master determining force, right? Is it race? Is it class? Is it gender? As though we can't think about those things and how they operate together. In many of those articulations and expressions, when people talked about class was understood as almost like just a parameter of identity, like it's just whether you're educated and have money, as opposed to class having something to do with modalities of production or larger structuring forces. Recently, we've actually seen the higher visibility, I think, of this concept of racial capitalism. Actually, not really a recent term in a way, but and I've seen it circulate more, in leftist struggle and in scholarly circles. And I think this book really, it seems to be a theme that runs through every chapter of this book, really putting flesh on it too, because there's another ways where people can toss out the sort of term that's in vogue, but not really know what it means, just to kind of show off our political currency. What I love about these chapters is the way that it actually gives you some history that shows you how these mechanisms arise. Could you talk to us about why you chose to kind of center racial capitalism in this book, and how you did it? What are some of the most important insights you have in terms of these histories?
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing I wanted to mention is that I also wanted to thank my editor, Anthony Arnove, and Haymarket Books. This book wouldn't exist without them. They came to me and wanted me to take some essays that I'd written and then turn them into a book. And I wanted to thank them as well.
Shout out to Haymarket.
Yeah, Haymarket has done amazing, amazing work, and really republishing works of the historic left and encouraging a whole different, really, generation and group of people to publish books. So that work of printing and reprinting and publishing new books is so important, especially in this moment. So racial capitalism. I think that I came of age in the 1980s, and it's nice to be in the People's Forum, because actually one of the founders of People's Forum, Roy Singer, his sister Shanti Singham was a teacher of mine and was very much about teaching a tradition of Caribbean Marxism, of Black Marxism, of C.L.R. James, of Eric Williams, of W.E.B. Du Bois, and many others, and of course Walter Rodney, who was someone whose ideas and work and also his life as an organizer, that I think of him all the time, how capitalism, underdeveloped Africa, and then the different ways that that kind of analysis was adapted to talk about the Black diaspora throughout. So, I'm coming of age at the very tail end of the Cold War, and Black Marxism was an absolute revelation to me. Black Marxism, the episteme. And then later I read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, quite a bit later actually. But I think that that was the tradition that I came out of. And it's been interesting to see Black Marxism in some ways refigured also into discussions of racial capitalism, because before that term had a currency, it was coming out especially of this complex engagement in race and class that decentered Europe, thought imperialism was essential, much the way it was for the Panthers in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's really, it's those kinds of works that made me want to become a historian in the first place. So in terms of racial capitalism, the first person I heard use this term was Cedric Robinson in his book, Black Marxism. And he took it from South African activists in the 1970s who were trying to explain the centrality of capitalism to apartheid, but also to talk about class fractures within the opposition to apartheid, which ultimately proved very predictive in what we saw in the 1990s and beyond, where we have a creation of an oligarch class that was once part of an anti-colonial struggle, but then ultimately became kind of oligarchs in South Africa. And so I think that one of the reasons racial capitalism has so much currency now, it has to do with that double-sided piece about it being essential to have a racial analysis of class. And we are in such a dire moment in the United States where we're looking at the consequences of deregulation, of federal retreat from the welfare state, where the consequences of the political and environmental and public health consequences of capitalism are so present in the lived crises that we're all experiencing. And with the movement for Black Lives, I think that it articulated a major form of opposition to this. So that's the first reason I think we're talking about racial capitalism, is that we have had, in some ways, a successful movement over the last 10 years that has insinuated itself into people's consciousness. The other reason is that we're seeing a rebirth of class reductionism, which is really unfortunate. I think that we're seeing different kinds of opposition to the liberal order. And the question is, can you fight capitalism without an anti-racist analysis? And this is where I think racial capitalism is essential. One of the things that is present in the essays is that I've written both about the history of Black struggle and organizing and Black Marxism, but I also am interested in structural analysis and trying to think about where economics and political economy fit into racist campaigns and punishment campaigns like I talk about with the war on drugs.
100%. And I think, I just want to talk also, I think there's an intervention here about the term structural racism. For most of my life, when you talked about race, the task for left and for progressives was to sort of assert that there is such a thing called structural racism, that all racism is not about bigotry and attitudes, right? And that there was an real, resistance to that. That tradition is very much still with us in actually a really aggressive and hostile fascist mode that is unfolding. However, I'm going to say something that maybe is controversial, which is I actually think that many of the forces arrayed against our movements right now have embraced the idea of structural racism, because what they figured out is that as long as it's mystified and sort of exists in this unclear, imprecise way, there's a way where we can just sort of refashion it as another kind of attitudes and bigotry. Organizations, we're fighting it. So structural racism in the organization becomes, you can fight it through implicit bias testing. You can fight it through the right positioning, the right kinds of people in still a capitalist architecture, and then that becomes defeating structural racism, even though you haven't actually. So I think that in that regard, the examples that you give in the book around opioids, around so many different other areas, around police, right? And the carceral state and carceral capacity, to use a term that Naomi Murakawa lifted up for me, right? Because and I just want to say, thinking about structural racism, not even just police, right? I mean, look at policing now. We just had the Alphabet Union saying, if you're really concerned about reproductive rights, you need to look at Google surveillance because they can determine who's been to a reproductive center, and that's going to be a key mechanism of policing. We're not even, so, you're confronting a police department, you're not even thinking about that. So we have to think about capacity. And I think that this book, through its history of these mechanisms, also allows us to sort of clear away. I mean, in some ways, what I want to argue is that we have to push back in some ways against some definitions and expressions of structural racism, just to say that. But to dig in actually to opioids, let me tell you something. I don't know. I don't want to say if you only read one essay because you have to read the whole book over and over and over again. But you might want to start with the introduction, but get to this essay on opioids. I'm still processing all the different work that it does. So could we just slow down, and you'll pardon me because I might have us break this down a lot because I just think it's a lot. There's a lot of richness in this essay. Could you talk about? Let's go back to how the war on drugs is being talked about. Maybe in the larger media, maybe even on the left, just popular leftists. And then let's also think about the ways that the Trump administration really intensified and ramped up an idea and rhetoric about the war on drugs. So you're seeing this, and what kind of inspires you to talk about opioids in the way that you did?
So this essay, it's called How Race Made the Opioid Crisis. And I wrote it in response to someone asked me to write a piece on racial capitalism. And I was trying to think about how best to do it. And the example that resonated the most with me was the prehistory of the opioid crisis. And this was written in 2019. Now we have a ton of reporting about this because of the litigation that's going on at both the municipal and state level, where essentially county level, where local governments are going to sue Purdue Pharma and all the other pharmaceutical companies that were selling opioids for essentially trying to recoup the cost of all the harm that was created by them. So we've had a lot of coverage about this. But in 2019, there was less. There was still a lot of organizing about it and investigative journalism that had been done, but it wasn't present and legible the way it is now. Drawing on the work of some important drug ethnographers, Helena Hansen and Julie at Drug Policy Alliance, they had started to think about white opioids as racialized. And so I go into the history about how did we end up deregulating opioids and having them prescribed to people for at very, very high concentrated doses for everything from knee pain to even, mild discomfort. How did that happen? We have such long evidence in human history of the physical dependence that is created by opium-derived products. So how did this happen? And it turns out that the deregulation of opioids goes back to the 1980s, to the Reagan Revolution, in which you had pharmaceutical companies that were remixing and remarketing opioids. And one of the ways they were able to do this was to argue that the populations to whom they were going to be sold would not become addicts. And if you go back and you look at the advertising campaigns and the literature by Purdue Pharma, you see overwhelmingly white normative subjects who are represented as essentially immune to addiction. So why does this happen in the 1980s? How does this fit in with deregulation? Well, it turns out this is going on at a time where we're reaching kind of the apex of the drug war under Ronald Reagan. I mean, more people are incarcerated under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, but Reagan is really the beginning of the story of the deregulation of opioids. And so you have pharmaceutical companies that Purdue Pharma leads the way, but there are others that are involved as well. They essentially set up these not-for-profits that they fund who are trying to change the meaning of pain and arguing that pain should be the fifth vital sign. So they do this through a really well-coordinated campaign of hiring doctors, of trying to change common sense, funding NGOs that were really supposed to be focusing on this terrible unmet need of pain. And it was racialized because the nature of the history of drugs has been so integrally linked to imperialism and race, so that the criminalization of drugs, and it goes back earlier even than this, but I think it's important to think about 19th century Chinese immigration policy, that it was the use of the trope of the opium smoker and of opium, the way that Chinese migration was associated with opium addiction. Of course, we know the history of why China had high consumption patterns, which had to do with the opium wars, in which Britain fought in order to open up Chinese markets to opium. So it's directly related to the history of imperialism. But whether it's the cocaine scares in the South and northern cities in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the use of marijuana and linking it to Mexican and Central American migration, and then, of course, in the post-war period,
even the term marijuana, the reason why we call this cannabis marijuana, right?
Exactly. It's essentially a racialized term.
And actually, could I don't want to interrupt, but there's so much just happened there, by the way. I don't know if y'all caught that. A lot just happened there. So one, and just jump in if I'm getting this wrong. But so one thing is, when we talk about deregulation, right, the ways in which, all these sort of barriers were removed for, companies to be able to do all kinds of things in the 80s, I hadn't really seen enough attention paid, or really any attention paid, to deregulation of pharmaceuticals. Of course, I'm in media, so we think a lot about media. So that was an important intervention.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I'm definitely going to get there.
Okay, cool. Okay,
I promise.
Okay.
I'll
I don't
get
mean to
there.
stop. I'm just trying to slow down, but you just mentioned it. Okay, and then one other thing you're saying is that but as Purdue is making the case, they're literally using this long history of racial tropes around drugs simultaneously, right?
Exactly. That's why I wanted to go back into the history, which is to say that the long, long history of drug scares was at its core about race. So it doesn't start just with African Americans and crack in the 1980s, that it is this long history of associating populations of color and using these populations as a justification, often for criminalizing this consumption of drugs, of illicit drugs. So because of that history, in the 1980s, you have two things happening simultaneously, which is mass arrests and incarceration and the creation of the trope of the crack baby and the crack mother. This is the prehistory to the idea of the super predator that Hillary Clinton talks about in the 1990s. I have an essay just on that we can talk about some more. So while you have these really warehousing of young populations of color in jails and prisons and maximum security facilities, you're having pharmaceutical companies who are essentially looking to an anti-state movement to market enormous amounts of opioids to make money. And some of the same people who are drug warriors, Ronald Reagan, Rudy Giuliani, who was responsible in 2000 for more arrests of marijuana than any time in New York's history. 2 years later, Rudolph Giuliani is working for Purdue Pharma in order to help use his political connections to deregulate opioids and allow this mass selling of legal opioids. So essential to this campaign was separating out white users and saying, it's okay to mass market these drugs. They're going to be marketed to middle-class people and people in rural areas, not traditional urban markets. And they explicitly use these terms. And it's an example of how the idea of white impunity was core to how you could deregulate opioids. We are now living in sort of two stages beyond this, where the deregulation has happened. Of course, we know about the mass addiction crisis that follows, that all of these municipalities and states are dealing with, and people have turned now to illicit consumption. And the character of the opioid crisis has now changed. Like, Black and brown people are dying at much higher rates. But if you go back to the origins of how did this happen, again, we see race at the center. So I want to just hold in the frame simultaneously that we had this incredibly violent, destructive motor for mass incarceration in the drug war. At the same time, we saw this deregulation of opioids. And I was shocked when I looked at the figures that 80% of the world's opioids are consumed by the United States, who are 5% of the world's population.
Wow.
So the enormous wealth and capital that this produced. But again, this is to me the example of racial capitalism, how race was used in order to support deregulation while of illicit drugs, while simultaneously mass incarcerating populations of color for illicit drugs. To come back to the original question about Trump, is that, of course, we all know how Donald Trump was elected. I mean, the quote that helped, inaugurate his presidential campaign after he claimed that Barack Obama was not a US citizen was that essentially Mexicans are rapists and that the worst among them is coming to our country. He used the same frame to talk about the opioid crisis, which is essentially these are people migrating across the border who are bringing drugs, who are putting white people in peril.
Yeah, it's just so, it's such a great essay. I mean, just thinking about how Giuliani embodies all of these trends, right? And Reagan, he's literally, punishing people, unleashing the carceral state on people for cannabis, and then later is defending Purdue. It's amazing.
And
right?
using all of his political connections. I mean, they hired him as a lobbyist. Right? Because they knew. So it's simultaneously, he starts working for Purdue in 2002, and the deal that he negotiates with Purdue made it possible for them to continue selling opioids. Already the problems were known by local communities and municipalities and state governments. And so they were trying to shut down the production of OxyContin and all the different forms that led to mass addiction. But Giuliani negotiated a deal that protected them and allowed them to continue to sell opioids for over a decade later.
And we've now seen this precedent be, we just saw, I think McKesson was sort of victorious in their lawsuit in Virginia, West Virginia, I'm not sure. But I also want to illustrate, earlier I made the claim that, this book is really important to inform our movements right now. And I want to give an example of that. As I was walking down 37th Street, I noticed there's a harm reduction center on this block. We had there's a harm reduction movement, I think, and both in public health, formal public health institutions, and in leftist and progressive movements. In Philadelphia, there was a strong movement, but because these conversations about drugs are sort of soaked in these histories of racial capitalism, it's a very complicated territory to navigate in Black communities. There are a lot of people in the communities that would need to sort of benefit from harm reduction, who are worried and don't necessarily want to have some of these kind of safe houses put in their communities, or are unsure about it. And I think, and justifiably so, because they're trying to grapple with these contradictions that they see. Even sometimes they have varying levels of understanding of the full architecture, right? So they're like, well, I know we were targeted differently than white heroin, or people were what they were dealing with. I know that these things aren't being placed equally in every community, right? And so I think that you really need this kind of history to really wrap your head around that, and for us to think about what this means strategically. It's just really, really important, I think.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
There's a statistic that I found when I was researching this essay, and I'm also using it and explaining the history of it in my book, Capitalism Plus Dope. But in California, from I think 1994, through 1986, which was the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which it's those two acts in 1986 and 1988 that enshrined the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for powder versus crack cocaine. So from 1986 to 1994, with the passage of major anti-crime legislation by Bill Clinton, not a single white person was arrested on federal crack charges in California, the largest, most populous state in the Union.
Even in like Denver, right? Oh my God.
In California.
Yeah.
And I was so shocked by that. So one of the arguments that the essay makes is that you have this couplet of black and brown criminalization and white impunity, and they sit together, they are inseparable, and they play themselves out in federal crack policy. What this meant is that black and brown people that are accused of possession and sale of crack are prosecuted on the state level. I'm sorry, white people that are convicted, the small number of white people that are prosecuted on the state level. Whereas it is often the decision of the prosecutor about things to be moved to federal charges. And 98% of charges in federal court win. It is almost impossible to win in federal courts. So that relationship even between state and federal. So you literally have crack enshrined as a black crime, even though the government's own data from NIDA said that 2/3 of all crack users were white.
Wow. I just also want to add that I think there's one of the reasons why I think this conversation is really important in Philadelphia is because in fentanyl, and I guess in some ways, I want to be mindful of time, but I want to talk about your future research. But we do have, a problem with overdoses, such that overdoses actually kill more, multiple times more people, black people, for example, in a city like Philly, than even gun violence, even though as much spectacle as you see around gun violence. And so thinking about this origin of the political economy, who has benefited economically from that distribution, right? And all those things. I mean, some of that it's complicated because some of it a lot of it does have to do with fentanyl. But speaking of that, could we talk about what your kind of next projects in this area are gonna sort of go into and related to opioids? Because I know you're gonna continue and expand this research in certain ways.
So the book that I'm currently working on, tentatively called Capitalism Plus Dope, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs, is about Los Angeles. And it's a history, essentially, of the war on drugs in Los Angeles from the late 70s through the 2000s. And it's a history of both the war on drugs and the crack economy itself, which was really seen as a form of harm. So I'm interested in how the state creates the conditions for drug crises. And in many ways, the state is the source of crime. The book ends by looking at the Rampart drug scandal, which is arguably should have been one of maybe the biggest drug scandal in history, in which you had LAPD officers who were directly involved in dealing crack, are also involved in working for Suge Knight. That's a whole other piece of the story. Yeah. It's a kind of deep cover scenario that you would think is fiction, where the fact is worse than the fiction. So it's a history of the war on drugs and the crack crisis itself. It looks at both the local and the global dynamics, because the real prehistory to the crack crisis in the United States were the anti-communist wars in Central America, in Bolivia, in which the Reagan administration supported the Bolivian cocaine coup, and then the creation of the Contra Army, which was financed through illegal drug sales in the United States. The precedent for this is the drug crises, the heroin crises in Southeast Asia. So there is a long history that is well documented about the ways that anti-communist wars became important in funding, and that illicit drug sales became important in funding anti-communist wars. That was true in Southeast Asia, and it was certainly true in Central America.
Wow, well, I can't wait for that. And again, I mean, I think that the way that you bring political economy to it is really important, because as you were mentioning, even with previous iterations of critique of opioids, some of the really great, books and media pieces, but they still kind of focused on like doctors, as though it was just individual doctors that were the sort of ultimate way for us to understand the problem here, although they were complicit. And I think this analysis is so much more capacious and needed. I'd like to turn to, a couple of years after the Ferguson uprisings, I remember calling a friend of mine named John Bonds, who was running a food truck in the midst of those protests. And I asked him, I checked in with him. I said, how are things going? And he's like, oh man. He goes, we've had some progress on the police, but we're now being killed by opioids. And that thinking about that story as a way to turn to your history of the Black Lives Matter movement a little bit. Um, the way that the Black Lives Matter movement was narrated, and this has a long history, and that folks like Todd Gitlin and many other people have talked about, was that it ultimately became narrated around some personalities, right? It became, many of the personalities were people who had done, important work, right? People like Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, also later people like DeRay McKesson and Janetta Elzie, and then other folks whose names I'm not gonna mention. But these figures became a way that people understood the movement after a while. And I think that dialectically at times may have had some advantages in terms of cutting through and raising certain voices, but you offer, I think, a much stronger history along with people like Barbara Ransby and other folks in a better way to understand what's actually going on with these movements. So could you talk about, how you approach this, what you see as some of the limitations and victories? And let me just add, in light of time, because I think maybe we'll need to wrap up, or I want to invite people in for a Q&A, but this is a complicated time for thinking about Black Lives Matter, sort of disambiguating, like the Black Lives Matter global network from what the movement is and what its legacy has been. So any thoughts that you have about that, I'm interested in as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts too. I think that there are two essays that really speak to the MBL movement for Black Lives Matter movement. The first is Ferguson's Inheritance, which was really written by me being on the ground in Ferguson in 2014, both in August when the rebellion jumped off, and then in October, as well as subsequent visits. And I mention that because I think there are two different kind of streams of history. One is just mass protest. So, what was inaugurated with Ferguson really through George Floyd protests, Breonna Taylor protests last year. So these are the largest total during 2020. These were the largest in terms of mass demonstrations, the largest protests in our history. The New York Times estimated up to 26 million people went out on the street, and 40% of the counties throughout the US, large numbers of those being majority white counties. So the scale of protest and response that happens during the pandemic is one of the most notable in our history. But I tell the history of Ferguson, and that matters to me because this was an example of a Rust Belt city that's in the Upper South, that, my own family is from St. Louis in many generations, and so I have a kind of intimate knowledge of St. Louis. And I was thrilled and surprised to see that it would become the site of protest. But you had a lot of poor and working class people that were locals, obviously, who were involved in this. And one of the reasons we know about Ferguson is that they stayed and protested for 2 years. And they counted the days, starting with the first day with the killing of Michael Brown. So this went on for, 600 or 700 days of organized protest. And I interviewed people involved in it. You had formerly incarcerated people that this created the occasion to essentially come out of the closet and talk about being incarcerated. You had people creating organizing forms of giving each other rides to protests, and it tells some of the history of how ordinary people in St. Louis and Ferguson and North County, which is also where my uncle lives, how they sustained that level of protest. The essay on the movement for Black Lives is more about the organizational history of people came from outside, from especially New York and California and other parts of the country. And Ferguson became crucial to rooting and legitimizing other groups of people. And I remembered thinking at the time of the complexity of what this was going to mean, that you have local people protesting, and then you have people that in some ways are best positioned to speak for and to organize nationally. And I thought there was always going to be this tension between the local and then the people that had come to Ferguson. So I hold up in my essay for the movement of Black Lives, the origins of the Black Lives Matter network and its three founders. One notable thing about this is that in the 1990s, there was all this prediction about the digital divide, that somehow Black people were not going to catch up in the digital divide. And I think the use of Twitter and the higher percentage of Black people using Twitter, the phenomena of Black Twitter, was crucial to the creation of that network. But you have a more material history of organizers on the ground, and I tell the history of the Dream Defenders, who were essential to the organizing around Trayvon Martin and when Zimmerman is not convicted, their protest in the State House. And so I tell the story of the Dream Defenders, BYP 100, and the network as three different kinds of expressions that you see in the movement for Black lives. One of the reasons I thought the Dream Defenders were so important is that they are on the ground at kind of ground zero with the killing of Trayvon Martin, which becomes the catalytic spark, and then we have Ferguson. And they articulate an explicit anti-capitalist politics in which they recognize that their own genesis was born out of internet coverage and mainstream media. But they quickly become disillusioned with that because they see its limitations. They see the dangers of philanthropy, that what was essentially a locally based, rooted, organized movement that is suddenly being deluged with philanthropy from outside, and that the kind of internet politics is implicated in that, as is mainstream press coverage. So they actually have a blackout where they drop all social media presence and they decide that they remain a 501c3, but that they want to find an independent organizing model like the Panthers so that they're not being funded from outside.
Right, I thought that was so powerful how you point out it's not they had an analysis which they articulated publicly. They said we may be in this form a nonprofit, but we're actually don't identify that way. We identify as a revolutionary organization, right?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the discussions we need to have is a critical discussion of philanthropy and the roles that it has played, both corporate philanthropy and the Ford Foundation. We all know the history, or many of us do, of the Ford Foundation in the 1970s and the role that it played in anti-communist politics and demobilization of the Black Power movement. So I tell that history as a kind of alternate history of the movement for Black lives that really privileges on-the-ground organizing and a true lived anti-capitalist politics. Because I think that in fighting racial capitalism, we have to think about what a practice looks like, not just the embrace of ideas or the use of memes or the kind of digital articulation, but what does that mean? How do you actually practice that? And I think the Dream Defenders have been a constant source of inspiration. One of the other histories I tell is about Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen in Chicago, because much of what I learned about the movement for Black lives, I learned through Barbara and Kathy's convenings. So they've been doing this for a long time. It predates 2012, but using the resources of the university to convene gatherings and bringing activists and organizers from all over the country and creating spaces for people to talk, organize, create relationships that led to organizations. And this was really the genesis of BYP 100, which is another organization whose history I tell, who I thought had the most powerful articulation of a Black queer feminist lens, and link that to local organizing, contesting Anita Alvarez, the DA, in 2012, and both trying to articulate an alternative in terms of local city politics, but also remaining independent and doing different kinds of organizing. So bringing some of these local histories of organizations and who also had an explicit critique of hashtag politics, which I do think is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I encourage everyone to read it. I mean, I would say that, when you try to tease out what the sort of victories and progress versus some of the limitations of what is just called Black Lives Matter together, it can be tricky because it could look like you're trying to sort of cape for some problems that have really happened that I think need some real serious accountability. But I think that, reading this work and other accounts that really name those groups, the Dream Defenders, BYP 100, even in St. Louis, Organization for Black Struggle, right? Organizations that preceded, and then, and many, many other organizations, I mean, I wouldn't really include this as part of Black Lives Matter, but, there was some work being done around December 12th and stolen lives. Previous to that, there's a long history of people just trying to keep a record of all the Black people being killed, by the carceral state, all the people actually being killed by police. And I think that it's when you understand that is really what what sort of allowed for this tremendous momentum to emerge, then it becomes clear why we can't just let this be a narrative about a failed Black Lives Matter movement because of something that happened in Los Angeles. It's actually an insult and an injustice to all those groups who actually, some of whom have now critiqued the Black Lives Matter global network, right? So we have to account in a lot more of a precise way, and I think this history really helps us to do that. So I guess one other thing I'll say as a media scholar and someone who makes media and thinks storytelling and narrative is important, I came to Ferguson, and that is definitely one of the things I observed. There was all kinds of media being made, right? The news was there. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't feel very experienced as an organizer at that point, so I was live streaming because it felt important to document it wasn't actually one big march. If you watch CNN, you think Ferguson was like one big march going down the street. There was certainly a lot of people going down Florissant, but then there were these other groups going in other places and protesting, arriving at the police station at different times. So I was documenting, but there were also a lot of young people taking selfies. There were people just kind of doing Instagram, and all of that was a part of it, but there was clearly a danger with understanding the movement only through this kind of mediated version, and also that mediated version in a lot of different articulations was something that could be used by industries and some of the forces against us. One really explicit thing, which I've written about, is that those live streams were being picked up by major cable news networks, and they were actually broadcasting that content while not compensating those people who were facing down rubber bullets and tear gas, for example,
If I could add something to that, I was just in St. Louis last week visiting my uncle. He actually lives off of Florissant. And, during the protest, Florissant was called Jericho Road because it was the large street when the protest happened. I actually mapped the spatial geography of this, that when the protest started after the killing of Mike Brown, people saw it in Canfield Green, which is the complex that he lived in. And I would add that Canfield Green was called that because it had these huge, old growth trees. So it was a housing development, actually quite a nice housing development covered in trees. And so when the protest jumped off, people went down Canfield Drive and then made a right and headed down Florissant. And in my piece, Ferguson's Inheritance, I talk about why the protest went in that direction. And it had to do with a wall of police that were amassed on the left side who were blocking protests from entering Jennings, which is a majority white municipality. St. Louis is really every 3 or 4 blocks, you're entering a new, I'm exaggerating, but that's how it feels when you're driving. Every 5 minutes or so, you enter a new municipality. And there was a lot made of the critical coverage of Ferguson about, it's the same language that was used to talk about the 1960s. Why did they burn their own neighborhoods? But you actually had the police amassed and protesting Jennings, and so you had the place that was open for the protest to go was down Florissant. So I went to visit Canfield Green, and there were no markers at all that any protest had ever taken place there. There was no plaque, no public memorial. Canfield Green had been sold off to a new owner who called it Pleasant View, which had an irony. And the only way you would have known, and I have the pictures of, you could literally see the police chop down all the trees that surrounded Canfield Green because they wanted to be able to have full aerial surveillance. But as we know, this was also a form of collective punishment. And so when I drove to look at it, the only evidence you would see, you would have had to have known what it looked like before, was that it had been deforested. And that to me is a metaphor for some of the dynamics that Ferguson became a kind of ground zero and legitimizing point, but so many of the resources that were channeled towards the movement for Black lives in many ways eluded this place that was so important to the movement. And I was struck by that because, of course, my family is there.
Right. Yeah, and I think it actually illustrates that one of the vulnerabilities if our movements are too hinging on essentially moments of media spectacle, this kind of slower violence that unfolds afterwards then is not, doesn't make it into the hashtag stream. So yeah, I guess at this point, I want to give you an opportunity to say anything you want to say in closing. I do want to be able to open it up to Q&A. Other folks have questions, but I know you opened the book talking about the emergence of this new kind of racial, or not new, but this particular form of racial fascism. And in some sense, there's elements of that in the closing, but I don't know if there's anything you want to say just to close us out.
I think I'll open up for questions. I want to make sure people have time.
100%. That sounds great. Well, thank you, Donna.
Firstly, thank you for an amazing talk. Looking forward to reading the book as well. It's kind of a parenthesis to what you were saying around the digital lives of the protest and the movement. And something I've noticed myself was the idea in that, I guess, post-George Floyd context, as they say, about the structures of racism. We recognize structural racism, which is a kind of hermeneutic around most media outlets around the world, but particularly in America and UK. And what struck me, which is the point that you were making, was the idea that this is something that's atmospheric. It's in the atmosphere. You walk into Netflix or New York Times and you'll see an atmosphere of structural racism. And by changing the atmosphere or the climate, we then resolve racism. Whereas, from my perspective, many others, the actual structure is the economic structure, which is the one no one ever talks about. The capitalist mode of production, which most of our media is based on, will naturally, organically produce sexisms and racisms and classisms we see every single day. So there's a kind of battle there for hegemony and thinking about the language you use and its uptake in different kinds of epistemes. So with that in mind, one thing I noticed quite clearly was the ways in which the media seemed to open up vistas of space for Black and brown people in that post-George Floyd context, they say, for certain kinds of visibility as a cultural compensation to racism, the worst kinds. And if we can unite for a second Robinson's work on racial capitalism with Stuart Hall's work on the popular, and what Black and brown people do or lose to enter into the popular, I saw a new culture of performativity within the movement for kind of battling for space. I mean, thinking of Spivak or bell hooks and that kind of touch of essentialism we need. So my question to you, which obviously is a very elongated one, is, did you recognize it as well in that period of time? And if you did recognize that, do you think that's still a viable and acceptable strategy in that post-George Floyd context?
The strategy of a kind of cultural politics of visibility, of representation. I did see it, and I was thinking about a particular moment in Ferguson, October, where, what's the name of the hip hop group that came down? Dead Prez. Dead Prez came. And it was this moment where there was a bunch of celebrity presence, and Dead Prez was there, the national media, like constantly, light bulbs were clicking. And it was a moment where the world was watching. It really felt like that. This was the corporate media saw this as a spectacle that it could cover, and you had people coming from all over the country, but from really affluent areas to North County and St. Louis. And I remember just feeling this like in the pit of my stomach, that you have the struggles of local people, but it's this problem of the way that visibility is monetized. And it often has to constantly legitimize itself through rooting itself in a context of real struggle. And I was uncomfortable with it. And I think I'm an academic, and we're all implicated in various ways in the monetization of struggle and opposition. So I think it's always important to be self-critical, but I think that we need a practice in which we really foreground real political struggle is collective. And in order to have collective struggle, you have to break down individuality. So in the last 5 years, I've become very active in the academic, I shouldn't even call it academic actually, because it's an industrial union model. but getting involved in labor organizing in which you are creating, through bonds of solidarity, linkages between all different categories of workers, so that dining hall workers are linked to adjunct professors, are linked to tenured professors, are linked to graduate students. And I mention that because it is difficult. You have to break down your own entrepreneurialism. And I do think we have to name entrepreneurialism. And it's true in the university. It's true, unfortunately, of political organizers. It's what happens when you're transformed into an icon. And an icon is it's originally, it comes from a religious symbol, but in a capitalist society, this icon and iconography also is monetized. So I think we all have to be explicit about that and figure out practices to redistribute wealth and to share it and to share the resources with the people on the ground doing the work. And, because we're in such a dire moment that in some ways looks like it's only going to get worse, I've just been thinking about that. You never will have real struggle until you give things up. And I don't mean this as like self-victimizing or guilt, but there has to be this giving of things up. So I think from my point of view, the cultural representation piece, I've been watching Netflix, and Netflix in response to BLM did hire new positions. There was a vice president of diversity that was created, and these people were hired out of the movement for Black Lives. And there is new programming there that I've seen that I think is a direct product of that, and I appreciate watching it. But I do think there has been a cost, which is when you have corporate hiring of leaders of movements, this is a form of defanging the movements. It is about incorporation. And I think—
And defining.
And defining, and also diverting.
Right.
One of the people who appears in this book—
That's 3 good Ds. We got to keep defining, defanging, diverting.
We need a
yeah.
T-shirt.
Yeah.
Donna Murch, who was a Southern California Black Panther who passed away in 2015, and longtime organizer. And he'd always talked about how organizing in Los Angeles, several times he was approached by funders and offered money to start a not-for-profit, and he refused because he'd seen how much it had affected other local organizers. Because once you have your not-for-profit, you spend all your time trying to make sure you have funding for it. And to get funding for it, you need press coverage, you need relationships with elites. So, not-for-profits now are the core organizing infrastructure of the left in the United States. So it's not a matter of saying no not-for-profits. That's not going to happen. But I think we have to figure out how to have these difficult discussions about how do we continue to root ourselves in movements, to act in ways through solidarity, and to be self-conscious about not only incorporation into the political two-party system, but in some ways that's been destructive. But with this movement, I actually think some of the corporate and philanthropic incorporation was even more destructive. And we need to talk about that and find a way to do it that is not just ad hominem. I've had friends talk about this being true also for Standing Rock, which I can't speak to, but it's been true for multiple movements, not only for the Black Lives Matter movement. So to find a constructive way to think about how do we protect and maintain our movements and really act in bonds of solidarity.
100%. I'll just say briefly that I want to say something worrisome to go along with that, but then something that I think is hopeful, which is that what's worrisome is that the dynamic we're talking about definitely is one where, because there was a moment where I was being interviewed on a podcast about sort of racial politics, and it was a I'm trying to be careful to protect someone here, but it was a woman of color who said, sometimes I just want to do my job as a media person and not have to think about the struggle. And I was both empathetic to that, but it also made me realize that we're facing a very real reality where the people who could sort of have the spoils of struggle are a media class who themselves is not involved in that struggle at all, but then a position once Netflix and all these other companies open up the representation, people who live in some of the urban areas and are just kind of living a regular bourgeois life. And I again, I'm always including myself in this, right? Like I'm doing a project on police history. Suffice to say, after 2020, people were a lot more open to that, funding that project than they were before that, right? So there's a real need to think through what accountability looks like. So that's worrisome, right? Because I do see that kind of happening. And, these companies are very happy to just find person with the right identity features, open up the budget, and be done with it. No structural transformation. On the encouraging side, I think for our movements, there's been literally over 100 media companies have unionized in recent years. And so what we've actually seen is, it's funny because it's almost, I remember when I was working for Gimlet, to Making Uncivil, I was talking with some of the employees at Gimlet Media about union politics because I was looking at their working conditions. And I was like, I get that you're living the dream of being a podcaster in Brooklyn, but you also up at 11 p.m., still working on this podcast. And you know what I'm saying? And you don't have pay equity. So like, what about that part? And it was like a situation where they were, it was almost like people like, be careful talking about unions as though Chenjerai was going to be the person. I'm like, I wish I was that powerful to radicalize it. In fact, it was not Chenjerai at all. What it was literally just the contradictions at Gimlet that wound up causing that company to unionize, along with StoryCorps, along with so many other media companies, newspapers, Starbucks. So we're seeing, but particularly in media industries, over 100 media companies have unionized, which means that that class of folks also now has a different kind of political tendency present. I think that the task, for folks on the left is to push that even further to the left, because just because you have a sort of company union that is invested in your own social mobility, essentially, that doesn't necessarily make it have a revolutionary character, but it does mean that, these folks are in a union and understand those kind of dynamics. And I think that's a hopeful thing to build from. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. Okay. So this question isn't quite fully formed, but I trust that you'll kind of piece together a cohesive answer. I was just wondering, kind of like, to tie in the media piece and that you've been talking about with kind of the historical context of people coming together and forming and organizing. I was just thinking about how in I guess the first essay in the book, you speak about like UC Berkeley and the Black youth who are forming this group and how the history of their, the migration of their families is kind of provides the context for how they begin to organize and the things that they're focused on. Obviously, the context of what is happening in Oakland also impacts what are working towards. But I was just thinking about that, and then kind of the Black Lives Matter movement now, and how the upbringing and the context of what the people who are younger and at the forefront of this movement have had, have experienced and have had access to growing up. And also, for example, like the Michael Fortner, who kind of has like this reactionary kind of critique of Black people based on his upbringing that is kind of like centralized or, causing him to have those views. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what are your thoughts on the context of people who are either, young adults now or who are growing up now? What context this world that we're living in and the way that media is present how will that impact, not that any of us are able to predict, but the methods of kind of organizing in the future, because it has changed so much, even in terms of like the logistics of being able to organize with kind of like social media and all of that.
Oh, thank you for that question. Thank you for reading so carefully and closely and hitting some of my favorite points about everything. What came to mind to me is that when I was deciding on the cover of the book, my first book, Living for the City, the images are really important to me. I always put a lot of thought and effort into them because I love images. And I thought about using a cover from the Black Panther paper, another beautiful Emory Douglas cover. And it's a picture of a child with their fist raised and it says, "Youth make revolution." And as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about that. And because of the way the Panthers had been represented, they essentially were children. I mean, they were adolescents and people in their early 20s, especially in New York. You know, like I think Mark and Kim Holder were 14 and 16 who were part of the Panther 21, you know, who were facing life in prison and conspiracy charges. So the Panthers they were young people. I mean, they were adolescents, some just on the cusp of adolescence through their early 20s. And because of the way that Black children are never represented as children in the mainstream, you know, this goes to the way that, who was the killer of Mike Brown? I'm having a moment. Darren Wilson. It's been a very hot and humid day in New York. But, you know, he talked about Mike Brown as being like in the clutches of a monster. And this was an 18-year-old boy whose high school photographs we've seen. And I think core to racist representation is that Black children never get to be children. And so up until I started researching the Panthers, the way that they were represented, it never occurred to me that they were children and adolescents. But when I started reading about the genesis of the party and where it took place in a community college of kids that had just graduated from high school, some had dropped out and then gotten GEDs. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is a youth movement, and a youth movement of very young people. So your question resonates deeply with me about that. And the ways that they appealed to young people, the kinds of politics they created, the way that the lunchroom in Merritt College and the study groups, and even looking at the Panther archives, the Huey P. Newton archive at Stanford, seeing what was in there, that even the ideology of the Panthers in many ways reflects that it was young people experimenting with different ideas, bringing together Lenin with Melvin Van Peebles, with Mao, you know, in ways that were in some ways experimentation as these working class kids are going to college and are being immersed in a world of ideas. So youth are central. They were central to the formation of the Black Panther Party, and that's absolutely the continuity, kind of animating spirit of my work through the movement for Black lives. So youth is important. I think one of the difficult things is that the politics of generation, you know, it was Jeff Chang that said generations are fictions. I think that's how I start one of the essays. And he's right, because we all know, like, baby boomer, Generation X, millennial, we know that these are in some ways artificial creations that media use to make people legible. At the same time, when we begin to think about music, sensibility, political references, we know that it changes, like there's change over time, and there are ways in which we share things, often through culture of people of the same age group.
Kind of live a cohort that feels kind of real in a way.
Exactly. I mean, if you really want to know how old someone is, just quickly ask them their favorite songs, and right away you know, right? I've heard that that's a
Glorilla, but anyway.
Yeah, that's a whole other story about like people doing that on dating sites to figure out how to be younger by pretending that they like music that they actually hardly know. Yeah. But I think that this is one of the challenges, and the piece that I was talking about, digital and hashtag politics, that, you know, and this is affected by how old that I am. I think we have to figure out how to have this cross-generational collaboration to talk about the forms of organizing that were useful for different generations and how to use the world that is available to us now. And I think it's not practical to simply repudiate social media. It's not helpful. You're never going to be able to build and organize, and yet figuring out how to work together across these divides of age. One thing that I just do think is really profound is, you know, we're talking about chronopolitics. That's the term that Gabrielle Weinert uses to talk about the politics of age. And the reason we're doing this is that age has so much to do with class in the United States right now, that age is a big determinant, as is race, about how much money you have. Will you have the possibility of going to college or to buying a house? So I think age has become incredibly laden. And to say something more hopeful, I'm very worried about politics over the next 10 years. So in the short term, I see anything is possible. But in the further term, I see much greater possibility, because of the way that age is so linked to really to class and political economy, I see among my students, socialism has become very, very normal to young people in ways that was impossible for someone of my generation who grew up, watching the day after in the Cold War. So I think that drawing that line, from kind of the story of the Panthers migrating out of the South, and I really wanted to influence, I wanted to emphasize migration, both to link it to domestic and international migration, to think about those dynamics as coalitional, and then linking it to MBL, and then to look into the future, because I do think youth makes revolution, and that's the hope that I see for us right now.
Yeah, I think I can just, yeah, that's great. I don't have anything to add to that. Are there other questions?
Or comments?
Comments? Yeah.
As organizer, I'm wary of stealing the mic from anyone else who has a question. But of course, I'm curious for you, Donna, in terms of when you revisited these essays and collected them and organized them, what were some of the lessons that you learned, writing them from your, present sabbatical and like turning them into who you were writing it for? I guess that's two questions now. Who are you writing it for? Now that you probably wrote them without the intention of collecting them into a book. So how did your audience transform your writing, and what were the lessons that you took away in assembling it and putting it together? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. My editor is here, and I have to thank him because he played an important role, Anthony Arnove at Haymarket, of assembling these essays and envisioning that they could become a book. Without that, I never would have done it. The thing that struck me is how I have the same consistent obsessions. Like youth makes revolution, this real interest in racial capitalism. I've called it different things at different periods in my life, but that real interest in the material life of race and the material life of power. And I was surprised at how much, even though I hadn't conceptualized these things as kind of fitting together in the way they did, I realized that I've always been writing about some of the same themes. Assembling them in the aftermath of January 6th, kind of the last piece when I wrote the introduction and the postscript, was hard because they were written, even though they deal with the carceral state and mass incarceration, they deal with very difficult subject matter, but they were really written with a spirit of joy. It was as if I was taking on things that I felt empowered to because of the actions of all of these young people across the country finally organizing, finally confronting mass incarceration or targeted incarceration. And I think that's important. It's very hard to fight when you don't have hope. So they come from a spirit of optimism, even though they write about difficult things. However, when I was assembling them over the past 2 years, it was hard because we are in such a politically difficult moment. And I wrote another piece for Rosa Luxemburg about racial fascism, and I couldn't help but think about that. So we have a lot more work to do. And I think one of the big questions for me is how we create sustained political struggle. This, especially where the final essay ends with the creation of MBL, it's a celebration of it, and also it has elements of critical reflection. But I'm struck by the difficulty of maintaining organizations right now, and these questions about how do you create an independent, autonomous, multiracial left in a country like the United States, where we're being confronted. Really, I agree with Jason Stanley that we're seeing fascism taking over the legal apparatus of the federal government. So these are urgent questions. So I'm trying to remember that sense of real possibility and optimism that informed these essays, because I think there's a lot that's coming.
Absolutely. I actually do have I kind of want to give you the last word, Donna, but I will say, thinking about actually the last two sort of comments, one thing that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has talked about, that you've talked about, Donna, is the need for sustained conversation and spaces of sustained study and conversation. One of the myths that I think the forces arrayed against us have tried to put out is that young people who are not a part of universities somehow can't study or don't study, and things have to be watered down. And of course, there's just like a rich international history of working class people, even in the United States, thinking about the Southern Tenant Farming Union, thinking about the Black Panthers, thinking about all kinds of spaces like this, like the People's Forum, where people do come together and actually study. Because when we talk about media, social media, I would say when you look at those other contexts, there's two things that some of those folks historically weren't facing in the same way that we are facing, which is one, the attempt to be I look at New York now. I just moved to New York, and I'm amazed at how the enclosure has just advanced, where they're trying to separate a particular classes of people from other folks that we need to be in community with, and how in some ways effective that has been. The other thing is, so that can make it hard to kind of study in the ways that you need to study. Like right now, the study place I want to be is in Philly at the University Townhomes encampment protests in West Philly, but that's not in downtown Philly. Do you see what I'm saying? The second thing is there's a series of literatures that are books that have been written. One great one is by Johann Hari called Stolen Focus, which is that there's been billions in dollars put into making sure that our brains are literally structuring our neural pathways to make sure that we can't focus for things for a long time, in a way that we can write these kinds of books and read them in the way that you all have done. So I think that that's the hopeful piece of this, is that I think the People's Forum represents a pushback to all of those things. It's a place where we can be together. It's a place where we can have long conversations and difficult ones, where we can study and invite folks into. So I think this represents something really hopeful.
Everything Chenjerai said, and one of the things that has always inspired me is watching people create new forms of politics, like telling stories of Genesis. In Merritt College, it was the study group, and it was taking the focus away from Northwestern and Harvard and Columbia, which is how people had told the history of Black studies. They started with the most elite private universities. So, looking to working class people, and also looking to the areas that aren't the center of wealth and influence, I think is really important. And that's a source of continuity throughout the things that I've written. And it's a pleasure, I would say, to be here at the People's Forum.
Thank you so much to Donna and Chenjerai. Let's give them a big hand. I just want to say again, thank you so much for raising these issues of struggle, giving up something to get something so much bigger than us. I also had the question about imperialism and how it plays into all of this, but based on what you're describing about your next book, it's something I have a lot to look forward to. So again, everyone come by. We have so much happening this summer, and thank you again to Donna and Chenjerai, and let's wish Assata a happy birthday. Thank you.